Three. I hope you're well and have had a good day so far. Today in our history, we're going to be thinking about somebody called the Boy King, who was the inhabitant of the tomb that was dug up by Howard Carter. And we're going to think about why he was more, or why he's more important now than he was when he was actually the king and the leader of ancient Egypt. To be successful today, we're going to need to identify who Tutankhamun was. We're going to need to clarify how important he was in his life, so understand how important he was during his actual life on Earth. And then we're going to think about why his tomb had laid untouched for so long. And finally, we're going to see what we learned because of this. To begin with, on your sheets, you should have a couple of columns like this, a correct and an incorrect column. And we're just thinking back to our learning so far about some statements. So we've got statements underneath. Some of them might have errors in. Some of them might just be wrong. Okay. Some of them might be correct. So from these four, which do you think are correct? If you could copy them into the correct column, and which do you think incorrect? If you could copy those into the incorrect column. Pause the video while you do that, please, to see if you are correct or not, and do them on your sheet, please. Okay. So was the ancient Egyptian civilization existed 200 years ago? Was the river Ranger key to the civilization? Were pharaohs the rulers, or was it viziers? Did Egypt have no slaves? Let's see how you got on. Okay, so the ancient Egyptian existed, it was more than 3,500 years ago. It wasn't 200 years ago. Okay, the River Ranger was not real. Okay, that's Mr. Spring getting confused. River Nile was key to the civilization. Okay, the pharaohs were the rulers. If you remember, at the top of our chain almost of our hierarchy list, the pharaohs, then were the viziers and the nobles. Okay, and at the bottom there were slaves, because slaves did exist. Okay, slaves were those people who didn't have the freedom to make choices in Egyptian times and were used by people to do works that they chose not to do themselves. Okay. Right, guys. So we've got those three incorrect statements. See if how did you get on? I hope you did well. I'm sure lots of you did. And hopefully you've identified that the pharaohs were the rulers. Now we're going to think in a little bit about one particular pharaoh. But if we notice in our question sheet today, we've got the idea of civilization. So I think it's important we look at what civilization means. Okay, so civilization is the stage of human and social cultural development. So it's when people basically are most advanced. Okay, so many thousands of years ago, people were not as civilized. Okay, they'd not discovered how to be structured in their interactions. They hadn't got schools and roads and hospitals. But now, in our society, we are civilized. We have those things. Ancient Egyptian civilization was the point when they developed structures that labeled them to have an organized system of life. Civilization, the word stemmed from the Latin word from about 2,000 years ago of civitas, which means city. Okay? So when you have a big urban place where there's lots of people living, it's a city. And that's when you have a civilization. So you have shops, you have roads, you have hospitals, you have schools. That's civilization. Okay, I did put up, that's a picture of the ancient Egyptian civilization, kind of. It's not a great picture, but it's the idea that they had structures such as those pyramids, they had sphinxes, they had roads, there was elements of it. Words which mean similar things, so synonyms to civilization, are things like society or development. Okay, so when you have a structure for living, you have a society. Antonyms, the opposites, are words such as undeveloped. Okay, so if you it's words where you don't have roads, you don't have structures. That's when society is perceived as less civilized. You don't have laws, so people can just, if you steal my boat, I'll come and kill you. That's not civilized. In the civilized scenarios, if you steal my boat, I tell the police come and arrest you, and they try you. Okay, so that's more civilized. So those structures for how we behave are what's called civilized. We consider at Brookvale, but we have a civilized structure for lessons and for learning and for behaviour. But if I, as a teacher, come around and throw a pen at you, I'll be in trouble. I'll be sacked. Okay, because that's not part of our civilized way of being. Okay, we have rules, we have regulations. Okay, we have structure, and we treat people with respect. That's part of being civilized. Civilized. Ancient Egyptian civilization was centered, so it's centered around life around the centered on life around the River Nile. So if you remember that Nile, that river that runs through Egypt, and the farmers and the fishermen, and they all needed those elements of life, and it was centered around that. If you remember the three happenings that we've looked at before, those structured lives. Right, guys, that's two terms then, civilization. I've looked at those facts. Now what we're going to do is learn a little bit about Tutankhamun. This might be a little bit talky, so I'm sorry if there aren't many pictures, but because it was 3,500 years ago, there aren't many pictures of him alive. So he was born the son of Pharaoh and I'm sorry about my pronunciation, guys, Akhenaten around 1346 BC, around 3,366 years ago. Okay, so he would have been born then, 3,366 years ago. Okay, and he was born. He was the son of the Pharaoh. Now, he became Pharaoh when he was only 9 years old. So he was a little bit, he's 2 years older than you guys, and he became in charge of the whole of the civilization of ancient Europe during what's called the 18th dynasty, so the 18th iteration of the Egyptian Empire. It's really big and important back then. Okay, so it was a big job. Year 4, 5. Some of you, yeah, year 3s, you're going to be 8, aren't you, this year? So by year 4, could you be head of the empire? Fancy it? Okay. And he reigned for 9 years. Sorry, 11 years. No, 9 years. And he died very young. So he started being in charge. He started being the pharaoh when he was 9, and he died when he was 18. And that's because he died when he was 18. He's known as the Boy King. Okay, so he's known as the Boy King, Tutankhamun. Now, the fact that he only reigned for 9 years, part of the reason he actually wasn't that important as a king. Although he's historically important, and we'll look at why later, he didn't do a lot. He was only in charge for 9 years. He was married to somebody called Ankhesenamun, and she was the daughter of Queen Nefertiti, who was his stepmother. So it's a little bit like marrying his stepsister. But that was a little bit like how things were allowed to be back then, especially if you were an important person like a noble, a vizier, or a pharaoh. He had 2 children. Even though he was only 18 when he died, in his life he'd had 2 children. They both died when he was born. And inside his tomb, which was discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, inside his tomb were 2 babies which were wrapped up as mummies. And people think they were his babies, okay? Those his 2 daughters. Lots of people have lots of theories, which is kind of a word which means ideas about what killed him. Now, he was quite tall, even though he was quite young, he was quite tall. So he had this bone disease, which meant that his bones weren't very strong. And one of his feet didn't work properly. It was called a club foot. Some people still have that now. And it's something where it's trickier for them to walk than it would be for other people. Back then, we didn't have things like the Ponseti Clinic, which is a skill that some doctors have, which helps people wear special boots to correct them. And therefore, he might have found it very difficult to walk, and that might have hurt him. And gradually, because medicine wasn't as advanced as it is now, he might have become ill because of it. When his body was scanned 25 or 26 years ago in 1995, it shows that his leg was actually infected. Okay, because he had an infection then, they wouldn't have had the medical advances that were made in the 18th and 19th century, so 200 years ago, that could have saved him. He might have died of that. We don't know because we don't have his doctor's records from then. Also, when his body was scanned, it showed that he had this illness called malaria, which is an illness which lots of places particularly that are hot, so places near the equator, particularly in Africa and Asia, have experienced for many years, and it's areas which could kill people. So when, for example, British people went to Africa for the first time and tried to settle there, they hadn't built resistance to malaria, they died. And then the few that survived had to come back to Britain. But maybe because he'd had these infections from malaria, because he'd had this infection from his leg. We don't know exactly, but for 1 or 2 or 3 of these reasons, he died very young. It might have just been that somebody killed him. We don't know. Now, the tradition then was that you were mummified when you were a dead king. Okay, so it means you were wrapped in different elements. Okay, and we will look in the future weeks at mummification as the process. But he was mummified. And when he was mummified and wrapped in these different elements, and you're going to get a job next week to do some mummification, he was kind of preserved. So his body stayed there in his tomb for close to 3,500 years ago. Now, on top of him, something that's 12 kilos. That's like if you've got a bag of sugar, that's normally about half a kilo, about a pound. If you had 24 bags of sugar on his face, okay, it's made of gold, so it's very heavy. 24 bags of sugar on his face, but made of gold. This mask, and then his body was wrapped in these swaddling cloths. Okay, so his mummified body with this portrait mask on top of it, and therefore he was preserved inside his tomb. So his tomb was the most well preserved tomb that had been found in the Valley of the Kings, and 10 years after discovering it, Howard Carter worked on it. Why do you think it was so well preserved? Lots of the other ones were found. Why do you think his was so well preserved? Why had nobody gone into it and found it and taken it apart? Why do you think that? I think for a second. Somebody else. Why do you think nobody had gone in there and found his tomb? What do you think? What do you think, Ted? What do you reckon? What do you reckon, guys? You see if our idea agrees with yours. Well, the reason was because he was obscure, so he wasn't very important. Obscure means he wasn't very important, and he was only in charge for 9 years, so about a decade. Most of the histories scrubbed him out. He wasn't listed as an important ruler, so nobody went and looked for him. And his tomb was really small. Lots of the other pharaohs' tombs were much bigger. Therefore, when the Egyptologists were looking for them, tombs, they didn't find it because it was really small. If you think about small thing and the big thing, if you're looking for two things, if you're looking for something red and black, are you going to find the big thing or the small thing? You'll look for the big thing, won't you? And it's the same with the Pharaoh's tombs. In the Valley of the Kings, you found the big one. You might not have found the small ones until Howard Carter eventually found it. So therefore, it didn't get discovered. Two people, it was broken into twice quite early in its existence, this tomb, this underground place where he was buried. Because they were worried about getting caught, the thieves ran away. They stole a few things and then left the actual inner tomb undisturbed. And that's the bit that Howard Carter went back to that night to break through. That hadn't been, nobody had been in there for 3,400 years when he went into it, 3,300 years. Now, those Egyptologists, those people before Howard Carter and those other ones like Howard Carter, went through all the Valley of the Kings and found those tombs. Lots of them had been disturbed before. They went through every single one, and they found that loads of looters, so people had gone in and taken things from them already. Most of them 3,000 years ago. They'd been robbed many thousands of years ago of all the precious things. But because Tutankhamun's wasn't very important, nobody had done that. Okay? And that therefore allows us, doesn't it, to see all the things which are in it. This is his death mask. This is the mask that was placed on him when his mummified body was wrapped up. And because he's got this death mask on him, we believe that this is what he looked like, some of the elements, not the gold, some of the features of him. Okay. And that, so his face is maybe similar to this. And then around him, there were bits of equipment to show that he was a king. But because his face was preserved, we can actually kind of gauge what we think his face will have looked like. So this is what we think his face looked like. Okay. And we can see here that you've got the idea that his face has this strong nose, and we can see an idea of what he thinks of. And that's why he's so important. Not because during his life he was important, but because nobody came to his tomb. It means that people now can find a lot out from within his tomb. So those treasures that Howard Carter found, images or what he looked like, we can understand more about it. And we'll look at mummification over the next few weeks. What I'd like you to do now is to draw your own ancient Egyptian mask. So what you think you should look like, okay? If you were being buried in a tomb, what would you have? Your face maybe? And then what would you have around the outside? What jewels would you have? Will we use some foil if you've got some at home, some gold paint if you've got any at home? Then I'd like you to list 3 things you think are important about Tutankhamun, about why he was not discovered earlier. Why was he important in death more than he was in life? Now, I've talked a lot in today's lesson, so I'm sorry about that, year 3. But it's just because there aren't many pictures of him when he's alive. Just got this one of what we think he was like because he was so well preserved in his tomb. And that tells us a little bit about why he's so important. So 3 facts, please.